Warning: some content within this episode may be considered sexual by nature and triggering to many people in the audience. You have been warned. Deep down, underneath it all, I have the heart of a small boy. I keep it in a jar on my desk. Robert Bloch. The term Candyman can conjure up two vastly different mental images. One of a quaint, friendly older man who works the counter at a sweet shop that is always filled with children and laughter. Or a twisted, sadistic killer who lures people into the darkness with tricks and treats and promises of good fortune. Today's villain is two sides of the same coin: the friendly man beloved by children and the dark, twisted murderer. The Candyman, the Pied Piper, Dean Corll. Born on December 24, 1939, in Fort Wayne, Indiana, Dean was the first child of Mary Robinson and Arnold Corll. Arnold was an extremely strict father, while Mary was doting and protective of Dean and his younger brother Stanley. Mary and Arnold fought frequently and eventually divorced in 1946 when Dean was 7 and Stanley was 4. Mary would sell the family home and relocate to Memphis, where Arnold had been drafted into the United States Air Force. Despite her relationship with him, she wanted her children to have contact with their father. Dean was a shy, sensitive child. He rarely socialized and didn't take rejection or criticism well. Yet, he always displayed concern for the well-being of others. He didn't have the best health either. At age 7, Dean suffered from an undiagnosed rheumatic fever. This wasn't discovered until 1950, when doctors diagnosed him with a heart murmur. Sometime around Dean's diagnosis, his parents reconciled. Arnold and Mary remarried, and the family moved to Pasadena, Texas. This second attempt at their marriage didn't last long, and the pair divorced once again in 1953. Mary retained custody of her boys, and because the divorce was amicable, she allowed them to have regular contact with their father once again. Not long after this divorce, Mary met a traveling clock salesman named Jake West. They would marry and move the family to Vidor, Texas. Dean's half-sister Joyce was born in 1955. Mary and Jake started a small family candy company after they married. James would take the product with him and sell it while on the road for his salesman job. Dean and Stanley were very involved with the business, running the candy-making machines and packaging the products. Dean was particularly passionate about the business and poured many hours into the company. While he attended high school from 1954 to 1958, he was a well-behaved, quiet student and a loner, but he worked diligently at the candy company. Shortly after Dean graduated high school, his family moved to the northern outskirts of Houston to be closer to their candy company's customer base. Here, they also opened a brick-and-mortar shop called the Pecan Prince. In 1960, Mary asked Dean to move to Yonder, Indiana to care for his widowed grandmother. While he lived there, he developed a close relationship with a girl. She would propose to Dean in 1962, but he declined and promptly moved back to Texas to help with the candy company. Dean wasn't particularly fond of women, and this would only become more evident in the following years. Mary's third attempt at marriage would inevitably fail, and she would divorce Jake in 1963. Subsequently, she would begin her own candy business in direct competition with the Pecan Prince. With Mary as president of the Corll Candy Company, she would name Dean the vice president and Stanley the secretary-treasurer. The same year the business opened, one of the teenage boys who worked for the Corlls complained to Mary that Dean had made unwanted sexual advances towards him. Mary would consequently fire the boy. On August 10, 1964, Dean would be drafted into the United States Army. He would undergo training as a radio repairman and would eventually receive a permanent placement at Fort Hood, Texas. Dean hated military service, but this would not affect how he completed his duties. However, after only a handful of months, Dean would apply for a hardship discharge on the grounds that he was needed in the family business. His request would be granted, and on June 11, 1965, Dean Corll would be honorably discharged with a spotless record. Upon discharge, Dean returned to Houston and his position in the candy company. The competition between Corll Candy Company and Pecan Prince was fierce, so Dean increased his work hours to keep up with the demand for his family's products. Around this time, Dean would divulge to some acquaintances that during his time in the Army, he realized he was gay. He had a number of encounters during his service that helped him come to this realization. Other acquaintances came to their own conclusions when they noticed Dean's flirtatious behavior toward teenage boys. Later the same year, Corll Candy Company relocated to 22nd Street, directly across from Helms Elementary School. Dean would earn the nicknames the Candyman and the Pied Piper because he would give out free candy to the local kids, gaining their friendship and loyalty. He even put a pool table in the rear of the factory, which became a gathering place for local kids and employees. The company had a small workforce, but several employees were teenage boys. Dean was known to flirt with the boys and would also hang out at the pool table with the kids. In 1967, Dean would befriend 12-year-old David Brooks, who was one of the many kids Dean had given candy to over the years. David was a boy who had a stressful home life with divorced parents and was often bullied because of his appearance and glasses. He would spend a lot of time at the candy factory, hanging out with Dean. The nature of Dean and David's relationship was never innocent, however. Dean would take David with him on trips to the beach and give him money whenever he asked for it. Dean was slowly grooming David, and eventually, their relationship turned sexual. Dean would bribe David with gifts and money to perform sexual acts on the boy. Despite this, David would consider Dean a good friend and a constant presence in his life as he dropped out of school and bounced between his parents. They would spend a lot of time together, and David thought of Dean's apartment as a second home. Unfortunately, the Corll Candy Company would close in 1968. Following this, Mary would take Joyce and move to Colorado while Dean remained behind after taking a job with the Houston Lighting and Power Company. He would speak to his mother on the phone frequently after her move, but they would never see each other in person again. Despite the closure of his beloved candy company, the Candyman still had treats he could lure his victims with. Dean Corll's first known victim, 18-year-old Jeffrey Conan, would have his life taken from him on September 25, 1970. Jeffrey would go missing while hitchhiking from the University of Texas to his parents' home in Houston. Making part of the trip with his friend, Jeffrey was dropped off by himself near the uptown area of Houston. This was likely where Dean found him. He is thought to have offered him a ride home and subsequently abducted him. Evidence later showed Jeffrey was violated before being strangled to death. He was buried beneath a boulder at High Island Beach. Shortly after the murder, David Brooks would interrupt Dean as he was assaulting two teenage boys. In exchange for David's silence, Dean promised to buy him a car. David accepted, and Dean would purchase him a green Corvette. This exchange would cement David's downfall into the role of Dean's first accomplice. After killing the two boys, Dean would further entrench David in his dark world by offering him $200, or $1,630 in 2024, for any boy he could lure to Dean's apartment. David participated in his first abductions on December 13, 1970. James Glass, an acquaintance of David, and Danny Yates were persuaded to leave a religious rally and follow David to Dean's apartment. At the apartment, the pair were tied to opposite sides of Dean's torture board. Dean then proceeded to sexually assault the boys, torture them, strangle them to death, and then bury them in a boat shed he had rented on November 17th. Just 6 weeks later, on January 30th, 1971, Donald and Jeremy Waldrop were walking home and had the misfortune of being stopped by Dean and David. The brothers were coaxed into Dean's van and taken back to the apartment. Like Dean's previous victims, they too were sexually assaulted, strangled to death, and then buried in the boat shed. By the end of May 1971, Dean found 3 more victims with David's help. First, 15-year-old Randall Harvey was killed by a single gunshot to the head. Next, 13-year-old David Hillegeist and 16-year-old Gregory Winkle were abducted and killed together. After the disappearances, the parents of David and Gregory made missing person posters and offered monetary rewards for any information of their whereabouts. Elmer Henley, though he was 2 years older, was a lifelong friend of David and volunteered to distribute the posters. He also reassured the parents that everything would be okay. On August 17, 1971, Dean and David encountered another of David's acquaintances as he was walking home from the theater. David persuaded Reuben Haney to come with them to a party. Reuben agreed, but was instead taken to Dean's apartment, where he was abused, strangled, and then buried in the boat shed. After beginning his killing spree, Dean moved multiple times, never staying in one place too long. After a move in September 1971, Dean would pick up 2 unidentified boys to torture and abuse, one of which he kept alive for 4 days before killing him. Sometime in the winter of the same year, David would meet Elmer Henley. Likely believing Elmer would make a good victim, David introduced him to Dean. Dean had other plans for the boy, however, and surprised David by choosing to make him another accomplice. Dean would extend his $200 offer to Elmer, saying the victims would be sold into a sex slave ring operating out of Dallas. Though Elmer ignored Dean's offer for months, he grew closer to the adult. He admired Dean's work ethic and viewed him as something of a brother. Unfortunately, Elmer and his family would fall on hard financial times, which persuaded him to accept Dean's offer in early 1972. David and Elmer would have conflicting statements, but Elmer's first abduction was thought to have occurred in late February or early March 1972. With the enticing allure of smoking weed, Elmer lured an unnamed victim to Dean's apartment. He tricked the boy into handcuffing himself before Dean bound and gagged him. Elmer then left Dean to do whatever it was he did. It wouldn't be long before Elmer learned just what Dean did with these boys. On March 24th, the trio met 18-year-old Frank Aguirre as he was leaving work. Frank was an acquaintance of Elmer, so it wasn't difficult to coax the young man with the promise of beer and weed. Together, they returned to Dean's apartment. While the group was drinking and smoking, Frank saw a pair of handcuffs in the apartment. He picked them up, triggering Dean into jumping on him and cuffing his hands behind his back. Elmer would later say he had no idea what Dean's true intentions were and tried to persuade Dean not to kill Frank. To answer Elmer's pleas, Dean would inform him that he had sexually abused, tortured, and killed the previous boy Elmer brought him, and fully intended to do the same to Frank. And he did. After Frank was dead, Elmer would help Dean and David bury his body at High Island Beach. Despite now knowing the truth, Elmer would continue to be an active participant in Dean's murder spree. Elmer and David would help Dean abduct 17-year-old Mark Scott a month later, on April 20th. Unlike previous victims, Mark was specifically chosen by Dean as he had supposedly cheated him on a deal regarding stolen goods. Mark would fight back with everything he had, even trying to stab Dean during their fight. However, the young man would simply give up when he saw Elmer pointing a pistol at him. After Mark was subdued, he would be tied to the torture board sexually abused, tortured, and strangled to death. He too was buried at High Island Beach. Statements from David and Elmer would claim that, despite original misgivings, Elmer was especially sadistic during some of the murders. He admitted he was fascinated by the stamina people had when they were about to be murdered. The trio abducted a pair of teenage boys on June 26th. Billy Balch and Johnny DeLome were taken to Dean's apartment just as all the previous victims had been. And just like the previous victims, they were sexually assaulted and tortured. When Dean was done with the pair, Elmer strangled Billy and then shot Johnny in the forehead. The shot didn't kill Johnny, however, so Elmer strangled him to death as well. Both boys were buried at High Island Beach. 19-year-old William Rindinger was luckier than previous victims, but only as far as escaping with his life. After the trio lured him to Dean's apartment, he was tied to the torture board, sexually abused, and tortured. William was set free after David convinced Dean to let him go. David's plea did not go unpunished. During one visit to the apartment, David was chosen as Dean's next plaything. As he entered the apartment, Elmer knocked him unconscious. Then Dean tied him to the bed. Dean repeatedly assaulted David before finally letting him go. Despite all of this, David continued to help Dean. The next victim lost his life in July. 17-year-old Stephen Sickman was bludgeoned on the chest with a blunt instrument, strangled, and then buried in the boat shed. The following month, on August 21st, 19-year-old Roy Bunting was abducted on his way to work, gagged, and had his mouth taped shut. He was shot twice in the head before being buried in the boat shed. Stephen and Roy were not properly identified as victims of Dean Corll until 2011. On October 3rd, Elmer and David brought another pair of teenagers to Dean's apartment. Wally Simoneau and Richard Hembry were the next to fall victim to the Houston mass murderer. That evening, Wally called his mother. He shouted, "Mama!" into the phone before the connection was cut. In the morning, Elmer accidentally shot Richard in the mouth. The bullet would exit through his neck without killing him. He survived for several hours until he and Wally were strangled to death. They were buried together in the boat shed. Sometime in November, 18-year-old Willard Branch would disappear while hiking. His gagged and emasculated body would be buried among the others already at the boat shed. 19-year-old Richard Kepner would also go missing in November. He would suffer the same fate as many before him, dying of strangulation before being buried at High Island Beach. The first known victim in 1973 was 17-year-old Joseph Lyles. He had the misfortune to encounter Dean sometime in late January. In late spring of 1973, Dean Corll would change residence for the final time. With his father vacating the home he held in Pasadena, Dean would move into 2020 Lamar Drive. David and Elmer would both say that Dean grew more brutal after moving into the house. Both young men would also attempt to distance themselves from Dean after he took up residence. It helped that Dean was sick with a hydrocele, a buildup of serous fluid in a body cavity, at some point in the first half of the year, and David was busy with his fiancée, Bridget Clark. As a result, there were no known victims between February 1st and June 4th, 1973. At times after the move, when Dean was between his victims, his behavior would be so bad that David and Elmer would instinctively tell when they needed to bring someone in. On June 4th, they would do exactly that. Together, they would abduct 15-year-old William Lawrence. For 3 days, William was tortured and abused. He was then strangled to death and his body buried at Lake Sam Rayburn. Just 2 weeks later, 20-year-old Raymond Blackburn was the next young man to fall prey to Dean Corll. He, too, would be strangled and buried at Lake Sam Rayburn. Elmer would be attending classes at Coach's driving school on July 6th when he met their next target. He quickly befriended 15-year-old Homer Garcia and invited him over. The following day, Homer told his mother he was spending the night with a friend, then joined Elmer at Dean's apartment. Homer was shot and left to bleed to death in Dean's bathtub. When he died, he too was buried at Lake Sam Rayburn. A few days later, 17-year-old John Sellers would be the next victim. He was bound, shot to death, and then buried at High Island Beach. Still trying to distance himself from Dean, David would marry his pregnant fiancée, Bridget, in July 1973. This would temporarily make Elmer Dean's sole provider of victims. Elmer would make the claim that only 3 abductions between July 19th and 25th were done by him alone. Billy Balch's brother, 15-year-old Michael, was strangled and buried at Lake Sam Rayburn. Charles Cobble and Marty Jones were taken together on the afternoon of the 25th, and Elmer buried them in the boat shed when Dean was done with them. On August 3, 1973, 13-year-old James Dramala would go missing while riding his bike. Dean would tie him to the torture board, assault and torture him, strangle him to death with a cord, then have him buried in the boat shed. James's death would be Dean Corll's last. Just a few days later, on August 7th, Elmer brought his friend 20-year-old Timothy Curley to Dean's house to huff paint fumes and drink. At midnight, the pair left with the promise to return shortly. On their way to Elmer's house, he and Timothy saw 15-year-old Rhonda Williams on her way home. Nursing a sprained ankle and having just been beaten by her father, Rhonda was in rough shape. Elmer decided to invite his friend to join them at Dean's, and she accepted. Dean was furious. In Dean's eyes, having a girl in his house ruined everything. But after Elmer explained Rhonda's situation, he seemed to calm down. He ended up offering the trio beer and pot. For 2 hours they would drink, smoke, and huff paint fumes. Within 2 hours, all 3 would pass out. When Elmer awoke, he was on his stomach as Dean handcuffed him. His ankles had been bound, and his mouth was taped shut. Rhonda and Timothy lay beside Elmer in similar states. Timothy was naked. Seeing that Elmer was now conscious, Dean removed his gag. Elmer immediately began to plead and protest, but it fell on deaf ears. Dean was angry that Elmer brought a girl over and was now intent on killing all 3 of them. First, he wanted to assault and torture Timothy as he originally planned. "Man, you blew it by bringing that girl," Dean would say to Elmer. "I'm gonna kill you all, but first, I'm gonna have my fun." After shouting at his accomplice, Dean would repeatedly kick Rhonda in the chest. He then put a transistor radio on the floor between Rhonda and Timothy and set it to maximum volume. Leaving the pair on the floor, Dean dragged Elmer into the kitchen. He pressed a .22 caliber pistol against the young man's stomach and threatened to kill him. After half an hour of back and forth argument and pleas, Elmer promised he would help Dean torture and murder his friends. This appeared to work on Dean, and he let Elmer go. With the threat of death hanging over his head, Elmer would help Dean carry Rhonda and Timothy into the bedroom and tie them to the torture board. Dean said he would assault and torture Timothy, while Elmer did the same to Rhonda. By this time, both victims were awake and their gags had been removed. Timothy shouted and protested, while Rhonda asked Elmer if this was real. When he told her it was, she then asked him, "Are you going to do anything about it?" The simple question flipped a switch in Elmer's mind. At first, Elmer asked Dean if he could take Rhonda into another room. The request was ignored, so Elmer decided to take desperate action. he grabbed Dean's pistol, screaming at him that he had gone far enough. Briefly surprised, Dean climbed off Timothy as Elmer continued to yell, "I can't go on any longer! I can't have you kill all my friends!" Regaining his composure, Dean would taunt and threaten Elmer, advancing on him and trying to back him into a corner. He didn't expect his companion to pull the trigger. The first shot hit Dean's forehead but didn't fully penetrate his skull. He continued to advance on Elmer. The next 2 shots hit Dean's left shoulder. He fled the room, colliding with the wall in the hallway. Elmer fired 3 more times, hitting Dean's shoulder and lower back as he slid down the wall. Dean Corll died where he fell, naked, face to the wall. Elmer would later say that upon killing Dean, he thought the man would have been proud of how he handled the confrontation. Dean had trained him to act quickly and forcefully, and he had done exactly that. Sure that Dean would not be getting back up, Elmer released Timothy and Rhonda. As they dressed, Elmer said they should just leave. Timothy disagreed, saying they needed to call the police. At 8:24 a.m. on August 8th, 1973, Elmer Henley would place a call to the Pasadena Police Department. Before the operator could even speak, he blurted out, "Y'all better come here right now. I just killed a man." As the trio waited for police, Elmer would tell Timothy if the young man hadn't been his friend, he could have gotten $200 for him. In reality, Dean only ever paid Elmer and David $5 or $10. After police arrived, they found Dean's gun and arrested Elmer. He said he didn't care who knew, he had to get everything off his chest. When he was questioned about the morning's events, he told police what Dean had been doing. They were skeptical, but when Elmer dropped the names Cobble, Hillegeist, and Jones, they were forced to accept there may be some truth in his words. When police searched 2020 Lamar Drive, they found an array of items and tools that told a horrific story. The torture board, which was an 8-foot by 3-foot plywood board with handcuffs on nylon ropes attached to the top corners and nylon ropes on the bottom corners, was found in the bedroom. There was also a large hunting knife, rolls of clear plastic that Dean used to protect his room and wrap up the bodies of his victims, a portable radio that was rigged with dry cells to give it more volume, an electric motor with loose wires attached to it, 8 pairs of handcuffs, a number of sex toys, thin glass tubes, and rope. Dean's van was also searched. The back windows had been covered by opaque blue curtains to block the view of the interior, and the horrors within. There was more rope, a piece of beige carpet covered with stains, and a wooden crate with air holes drilled in it. A similar crate was found in the backyard, inside which were several strands of human hair. Elmer agreed to accompany police to Dean's boat shed in search of the bodies of his victims. The interior was innocuous enough at first glance. It only seemed to contain junk, but the items grew more and more concerning as they were hauled out of the shed. A half-stripped car, a child's bike, an old iron drum, water containers, 2 sacks of lime, and a large plastic bag full of the clothes of teenage boys. The first body was found by 2 prison trustees who were digging in the dirt. It was a blonde boy who was lying on his side, wrapped in plastic. After this first discovery, police began excavating the shed. They found victims in varying degrees of decomposition, most encased in plastic, some buried with the ligatures still around their necks. Every victim the police uncovered had been sodomized and sexually tortured in some form. Pubic hairs had been plucked out, genitals had been chewed, objects had been inserted into their rectums, and glass rods were inserted into their urethra before being smashed. One victim was recovered with his mouth agape, indicating he had died while screaming. David Brooks would present himself to police with a statement on the evening of August 8th. He denied all knowledge or participation in the murders, though he said he knew what Dean had done to Reuben Haney and Mark Scott. On the morning of August 9th, Elmer gave police a full confession detailing David's involvement with the abductions and murders. He would admit to personally killing 9 of the teens. The same day, he would accompany police to Lake Sam Rayburn. 6 bodies were found here, plus extra evidence discovered inside the lakeside cabin owned by Dean's family. Excavation of the boat shed continued on the 9th as well, and an additional 9 bodies were uncovered. That evening, David would give the police a new confession. He admitted to being present at several of the killings and helping with the burials. He continued to deny direct participation in the murders, however. The following day, August 10th, Elmer would help police find an additional 2 victims at Lake Sam Rayburn. Both had been tortured and severely beaten. In the afternoon, both Elmer and David would go with police to High Island Beach, where they would find 2 more of Dean's victims. Another 4 would be discovered on August 13th. As the search went on, families of the victims were highly critical of how the Houston Police Department conducted the investigation. As teens and young men were reported missing, the police were quick to write many off as runaways. No one but the families searched for these boys. By the time the excavations were concluded, police discovered a total of 27 known victims. This was only surpassed by John Wayne Gacy, who killed 33 boys and young men. Gacy would go on to say that the Houston mass murders had been influential to him. With plenty of evidence, indictments went forward and pre-trial offers were made. Elmer and David were set to go to trial. Elmer Henley's trial began on July 1st, 1974. He faced charges of 6 counts of murder. Plenty of witnesses were called to the stand, questioned, and cross-examined. Officers who read Elmer's statements and confession testified. A total of 82 pieces of evidence were presented. Elmer never took the stand. On July 15th, the court heard closing arguments. When the jury was released to deliberate, they took just 92 minutes before finding Elmer Henley guilty of all counts. The next day, Judge Dial sentenced him to 6 consecutive 99-year life sentences, totaling 594 years. Elmer would inevitably appeal his sentence, saying the jury had not been sequestered and there was a media presence in the courtroom. His defense also argued that he should not have been tried in San Antonio, but this was overruled by the judge. Elmer would be retried on June 18, 1979 in Corpus Christi. This trial lasted until June 27th when, after 2 hours, the jury reached the same verdict as the previous one had. His 594-year sentence remained. David Brooks's trial began on February 27, 1975. Despite being indicted for 4 counts of murder, he was only charged with the murder of William Lawrence. His trial lasted less than a week, and the jury found him guilty after only 90 minutes. On March 4th, he was sentenced to life in prison. David showed no emotion upon hearing his fate, but his wife burst into tears. He tried to appeal his sentence, but it was dismissed in May 1979. In just 3 years, the Candyman, with the help of Elmer and David, lured no less than 28 teenagers and young men to their deaths. The real number is suspected to be much higher, however. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, alongside the Harris County Institute of Forensic Science, are still actively trying to identify the 16th body recovered from the boat shed. An updated facial reconstruction was released to media outlets in August 2023. David Brooks, Dean's first accomplice, led a quiet life in prison, choosing to stay out of the public eye and refusing to do interviews. He died in prison in 2020 of COVID-19. Dean's second accomplice and ultimately killer, Elmer Henley, remained controversial after his incarceration. He makes art in prison and has created a Facebook page to promote it. He also conducts interviews, unlike his counterpart. During his interviews, he often says, "My only regret is that Dean isn't here now, so I could tell him what a good job I did killing him." Dean Corll was never made to face justice for his crimes, nor did he suffer in death as his victims did. It is unknown just how many lives this vile man ruined and stole. His quick death at the hands of his accomplice robbed many families of the closure they so desperately sought. But it ended a killing spree that would have continued for months, if not years longer. We here at Villains with Vaughn want to thank you for listening in to our podcast and hope that you find each case informative, taking lessons from the darkest moments of life while finding the silver lining within each tunnel, despite how evil and dark it may be. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check back every other Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for a brand new episode. Until then, please, from me to you, stay safe out there.